We'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Harvard Energy Journal Club. Today, we're going to hear from John Harold. He actually started coming to this club in 2015 when he was a postdoc in physics at Harvard here at Harvard. And now he is a Digital Learning Lab fellow over at MIT, although he also has many frequent sort of entrepreneurial interests and projects that he's working on. Today, he's going to tell us about bioplastics, which I'm certainly very interested in, also coming from a material science background. Just before we get started, as with this and future HVAC meetings, please, John, if it's okay with you, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question as it comes up. You can also put questions in the chat, and then I'll go ahead and ask them. But we love for these talks to be sort of interactive and a discussion. So with that, go ahead, John.
Hi, yeah, please interrupt me at any time. There's a lot of stuff here, and I guess I'm going to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer. Bioplastics is a terrible topic because, first off, it's pretty ambiguous, right? So bioplastics means, technically bioplastics means plastics derived from biological materials, but the way it's used is not just plastics derived from biological materials, but also plastics that are compostable. So a better topic title would be bio-based and compostable plastics. So that's what I put a little subtitle in for, and that's going to start a trend of this being a talk that kind of goes in a lot of different directions. Being such a broad topic, I'm covering a lot of areas. First, I'm going to go to this. Can allow me. All right. So as you see here, let me get. Nope. Let me go into a laser pointer. So you see, if you can see here, this is a little 4 quadrants ranging from non-biodegradable to biodegradable and from fossil-based to bio-based. Now these 4 quadrants kind of talk about the plastics as a whole, and this is used a lot in the literature. So I wanted to start with it, right? And it shows you kind of the diversity or the landscape of what we're dealing with in a fairly decent way. And so you see here in, I guess, quadrant number 1, right? It's both biodegradable and bio-based, right? You grow up some plants, you make them into some plastics, you put them back in the ground, and you get more plants out of it. That's the ideal. That is the dream, and that is kind of the goal for it. But this entire, when you talk about bioplastics, the industry talks about a lot of other things, right? So if you want to go over to quadrant number 2, I can point to it, quadrant number 2, you'll see things that are non-biodegradable but bio-based, right? And these things are often called in drop-in alternatives, right? When you grow some, you'll grow something from the ground, and it'll go right into the same plastics industry that you're used to, and it goes right into the materials and it works and can use the same recycling setup. But there's also things that are biodegradable and compostable, but they're fossil based. So you take the petroleum distillates and put it out of the ground, and you'll be able to, but then you can compost them and they'll go back into the soil. So that's another area. And then there's over here, quadrant number 3, you have the conventional plastics that are just what we expect to. We dig up oil out of the ground, we make them into some solid good, and then it stays around forever and ever. So that's kind of what we're going to be covering today, is covering those 3 areas that are biologically relevant. But one of the things that I'm going to warn you is there's a bunch of these abbreviations, right? PE for polyethylene, PET for polyethylene terephthalate, polyamide nylon. Where polylactic acid, PLA, is going to come up a lot. Polypropylene as well. PET, polyethylene terephthalate, is going to come up a lot. PBAT, polybutyl adaptine tetraphthalate. And TPS for thermoplastic starch. So just this is going to be made available, right? Amos, I'm going to send you a copy, clean up with better sources and everything. But you'll be able to come back to this. But if you have any questions on what these these things are, you can interrupt me and I can explain them, or I'll have to look them up because I don't remember all of them off the top of my head as well. Anyway, so another good way of looking at it is kind of, this is another way of looking at the landscape, right? You see, you have all these feedstocks, as we call them, right? So the feedstocks could be just naturally biodegradable, like you have the natural microbes, or the starches that are biodegradable, or you have things that are, you grow up and you design them to be a biodegradable product, whether it comes from fossil fuels or comes from crops, right? Or there are things that are non-biodegradable that yet still come from these different types of feedstock sources, right? And we can go into using these much more biologically similar monomeric starter units, or we can do these plastics that we've been using for years, or kind of do something similar where we're using some of these molecules, these building blocks, this chemistry that we've known for a while, incorporating in some of the feedstocks that are biologically relevant. But I guess we're going to go on to this, ideal life cycle of bioplastics. And this is another term that we're going to be using a lot, is this life cycle, because the goal for all of these biological materials is to be in a cycle, whether that cycle be composting, which is this ideal, quadrant 1 style bioplastics, are you grow these raw materials up from the ground, you extract them using standard methods, then you refine them into the monomers that you need to use, you process those monomers into the polymers during manufacturing, you can compost them, and then that compost will become the fuel stock for your new raw materials, and you go on the cycle over and over again. Some are biodegradable, some are not biodegradable, and we'll get into more of that. And as we go on, we'll differentiate more from there. But this is kind of this ideal when you think about it. But the reality is that it's much more complicated than that, and not everything fits into these different categories. And maybe you don't want everything to fit in these categories because you have different purposes and different needs, right? A more realistic look is this kind of cycle, right? So this cycle is a lot more, it's a lot more paths you can go down. So the numbers on the outside are, this refers to these global development standards. We talked about in some other presentations at the HEJC, we talked about global development standards, and I don't really cover them here, but this was a great graphic. So bear with me on the stuff on the inside. The stuff on the outside, you could read up on the global development standards yourself, and it's pretty interesting to see where we're trying to go. But these fit into those goals and aspirations for global development pretty well in these different areas. So we'll start on this cycle with the consumer use, right? We have an item, right? We have something we're using, and then we go to we use it and we put it into waste. We put it in either recycling, or we put it into some compost or something where it's going to be broken down differently. So mechanical recycling, it comes in, it gets reprocessed, we put it into, it stays as a polymer, right? It stays as junk, and these are like thermoplastics, and they can be put right back into the manufacturing of new products relatively easy. And the format's the same as it was to begin with, when it's in that actual polymer, right? So that's the mechanical recycling. You don't do any chemical changes. Then you go for things that maybe need to be chemical recycling, right? We see it gets a little more broad. So the chemical recycling, maybe we need to break it down inside of a biorefinery with enzymes or some other materials to get to these high value chemicals that we want to be able to keep. We don't want to have to remake those or store that or pull the carbon anywhere. And we get back to the monomers, which we then can plasticize, and it can become that feedstock to go back into the, or become that resin, if you will, to go back into the bioplastics. Sorry, feedstock is usually used for the starting material rather than this stuff in this particular industry. And then you have things that are composting. So composting could be in your regular aerobic digestion, and there's anaerobic digestion depending on the molecule, and those once again will give you the monomers or just the pure carbon, and then you'll get back into your process it to make the resin. Or the largest cycle here, the compost goes right into nutrients for the soil and mix up, and it pulls carbon out of the soil that you put in there, as well as carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And this is a fully renewable resource. You can go into the monomers if you want, or you can go somewhere else. And then once again, back to the resin and then back to the consumer, right? So we talk about these as industrial composting, home composting, and we'll get the difference between those two because that's actually a big part of it. And then mechanical recycling, anaerobic digestion, enzyme catalytic recycling, or enzymatic depolymerization. Those are the things where you have to break it down using enzymes or chemicals into these monomers in order to get built back up into the bio-based resins. All right. So on that note, I guess as promised, we're going to talk about composting, and this actually is a significant part of the industry of the bioplastics is its end of use. And so I suppose if I were to I could go into much more detail, and it may even serve well to just really talk about composting, and maybe in the future we can talk more about these composting for all the purposes that we can use for the bioplastics, as well as just the in general energy system as a whole. But with composting, there's a big difference between your industrial composting and your home composting. Namely, two things. One, where you're using there's a much more limited supply of things that are readily compostable at home. And number two is that there's a significant amount of pre-processing and maintenance that happens at these industrial facilities that allow them to compost much quicker. And so how's it all work, right? So in the industrial, let's go with the simple example. At home, you take whatever you're eating, you take your apple, you eat your apple and your apple core, you put it back in a pile in your compost, maybe turn around, and you will use that as, you can put that into your garden, you can grow more apples, although it would take a very long time to grow apples. Anyway, or other plants. So then you can do that, and that's your home recycling. But you can't put in the bones or the heavily oil fats or these compostable packaging. What you need you need the industrial composting. And industrial composting gets first chopped up into little teeny pieces. And if you remember your freshman chemistry teacher telling you that more collisions make more reactions, that's really the core of it. The fact that it has much more surface area, you can get a lot more of the enzymes and the microbes to interface with it, and you'll have a much faster digestion. Plus, the temperatures of the inside get much, much hotter and able to break down. The enzymes can work much more efficiently, and that's where they're designed, or they've come to work at those higher temperatures. And they even have the right microbes or fungus depending on what they need to do, their aerobic or anaerobic digestion. So that's one key feature here that's going to come up over and over again, is that there's a difference. And the consumers have to know that when they're composting things commercially versus at home, it's a completely different process. And while you could simulate all these things at home, it would be a much more active process than most people are looking for in a home composting situation, which is why these industrial composting, whether it's your municipality has it or you pay for it separately, you do that. And that's why you'll see what's that place like Clover, right? You go to Clover and they say, okay, this is everything's compostable here, so you have to leave it there to compost it. Don't bring it home and compost it at home because it's not going to break down the same way. Yeah, and so that's briefly what composting is and in industrial composting. And the next step is in recycling. We had a talk last semester or maybe sometime last year about recycling, about the whole recycling setup, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but what I'm going to do is show just a little bit. Waste Management is one of the larger recycling companies and garbage companies in the country. They have like 21 million customers. So they have this little infographic. I'm going to go through it, and it's going to be here in the slides if you want to go back to it. But just basically to get the concept of where we are, right? So most single stream recycling, the trucks come and they first have it and they get sorted. Now in these sorters, they're sorting a lot of the materials, and some materials are just not supposed to be recycled. People put it in there anyway. Some materials are too dirty to be recycled. Some are kind of small, and in these just bulky or plastic bags, they don't have the facilities to sort them or to actually recycle those. Then the paper comes out, right? The corrugated cardboard, and then the paper comes out, the newspaper and the other kind of papers come out. Then they have the steel that comes out, and then the glass. Now, glass a lot of times in a single stream gets broken into little pieces, and the bottles need to be maintained whole to be pulled out of this process. So in the single stream, it's got some problems with the glass. It's not really a focus of this talk, but it's kind of an interesting thing that came up during the conversation, during the study of this. And then you get rid of your aluminum, and then you're left with all your plastics. Then your plastics are all kind of both put here together. And this is where you need to be able to sort out the things that are actually recyclable and things that aren't. And sometimes in this place, you're going to wind up with a lower quality plastic because the plastic is going to be dirty, or it's going to have contaminants for some other materials. And in this way, you'll have, they call it upcycling versus downcycling. So some materials can be readily turned right back into it. If we have just some polypropylene and it's going to go right into some polypropylene pellets, you can put it right back into your molding machine and make more material like nothing happened. But sometimes things get a lower quality, and you're gonna have to like downcycle them or turn them into something else. That's why you notice like park benches, and you can go to like Home Depot and buy wood for your deck that's made of these like plastics, and those things are like post-consumer recycled plastics that aren't pure enough to make a consumer product that kind of needs a different type of feel to it, because that's really important, is the feel on the plastic. The quality is a little bit lower, but they can put it into those more structural materials. Okay. So at this point, we've been talking for 20 minutes. We haven't even talked about plastics yet, and that's the problem, because you need the context of recycling and the composting to really look at what the plastics are. So now we're going to dive into the plastics industry, which is also gigantic. I found this graphic kind of at the end is the general distributions of the plastics that we're using. So you see, like we're using a lot of polypropylene for a lot of durable goods. That's the blue. And we have the high density polyethylene, and that's the orange, and the gray, the low density polyethylene. I guess you probably use a lot of these in your lab. Materials come from these different ones, the high density and low density polyethylene, or like at home, the cleaning products and whatnot. Then you have your polyvinyl chloride, the PVC, that's used for piping and some other uses in that application, other applications for the PVC. Then you have your polystyrene, which is a lot of the single-use things we have, and those old CD cases used to be polystyrene. That's why it would crack so much more than other plastics. And you have your PET, which is those water bottles that you have. And then there's some other stuff that one category of other, right? You know, your rubbers and all those other different types of materials. Probably nylon goes in that one. So there was one of the sources, and when we post these slides, I'll make sure I put the sources in here. It broke down kind of some of the more larger types of these biodegradable polymers and bioproduced polymers. And it kind of gives you some of where the feedstocks come from. I'm going to go into detail on a little bit. The good part about this table that I retrofit for this talk is it talks about the end of life options, right? Whether it's the home composting, industrial composting, or anaerobic digestion, where these things go, because that's kind of the talk, is where do these things go at the end, right? So I guess starting with the bioplastics, like these are the actual materials and what they do. PLA and PLA blends, polylactic acid. This is the plastic cups that you get at Clover. This is the containers, the coffee cups that has it lining inside of PLA, because these things are more readily digestible, right? These are fermented. These come from a simple hydrolysis of cornstarch, product of the dextrose fermentation, lactic acid. The basic building blocks of the polylactic acid comes out of those, and we can further make them into the plastics that we have here, right? So, and one of the important parts that we'll get back to a little bit later on it is in order for it to get broken down, this needs to be broken down using some enzymatic biodegradation to break it back down to carbon dioxide, which then can get back into glucose. I guess the primary manufacturer of PLA is NatureWorks. It's out of Nebraska, right, where they do about 3 million pounds of their resin per year. So, and a lot of consumer products are starting to use polylactic acid and polylactic acid blends. Another one that is fairly widely used is your polyhydroxyl alkynates, right, or PHA. And so this one I think is pretty cool because it built up in bacteria. So bacteria is engineered to produce high amounts of this PHB inside of the bacteria, and then they're destroyed and they extract out all these starting materials, this PHB, and then it can then be polymerized and you can make it into your products, which then will degrade themselves. Right, those are some examples we have here. Are the bags, your compostable bags for your compost, right, or your garbage, or your dog bags. Apparently, some Target gift cards are made out of this, which I guess is kind of cool. It's like a single-use item that you want some durability with, but you want it to go away at some point. And then soil wrap containers. I guess that's a container where you can just plant, your root and all in the ground, and it'll grow. And yeah, so this is the one interesting thing about this resin. I think the name brand of this resin is Mural Resin. It's made in Clinton, Iowa. The Mural Resin, it has a higher ability to be broken down in marine environments, right? And there are some marine standards where this says it is actually marine degradable, and that's really important because you hear about all this plastic that's comes to the ocean, and the problem with that is that this biodegradable compostable, as we talked, needs to be in these very special conditions, and the marine environment doesn't have the special conditions that these more commonly degradable materials are. So that is kind of one of the downsides. People think it's gonna be the end of the pollution, but it's really not, because if you don't have the right conditions for it, or the right enzymes, or right concentration of microbes, or just the right microbes at all, it's not going to get there. So moving on to TPS cellulose and starch blends. For me, this was probably one of the first bioplastics I noticed, because on that, they feel significantly different, and you're using them, and it'll say, oh, it's made out of potato starch, or whatever the first cutlery I used was. And so what this does is they take the starches from the corn, the potato, whatever, and they break them into their monomers and then reassemble them in a much more solid and dense material, which then can be used as a thermoplastic. And that gets degraded very readily. And it's a much stronger bond than originally had, but you're using effectively the same monomers, which are these biologically derived monomers. And there are many enzymes that are designed to break down these starches, because that's what life does, right? It's got a lot of tools for its own stuff. So the closer it is to those biomolecules, the easier it is to get broken down.
John?
Yes.
Do you know when it's mixed with other sort of polymers or plasticizers, are those similarly kind of derived or biodegradable, or are they just, in small enough quantities that people don't worry about them too much?
I think the answer is like somewhere in between. So a lot of those plasticizers, those are small quantities. There's like they're catalysts to be able to make the thing happen, and what you're left with is effectively mostly just those monomers. They're all linked together, and the catalysts you do their activity, so they kind of don't get consumed by the reaction. And sometimes you have some plasticizers which are pretty small in comparison to the rest of those things. So yes, that the majority of it can be digested by it, and you have just a little bit of plasticizers left, and possibly some remaining of your enzymes. And it does really exist in the environment. It does have to degrade down. So those things are going to be left there. So kind going through this whole thing, there's a lot of aspirations and criticisms. So we're going to be able to save the world with all this stuff. Oh, there's all these problems. It's not there. It's a one, and that's really one of the keys to it. Is when it breaks down, what's left? Is it then able to go all the way into carbon dioxide, or another or another kind of fixed in a certain way into the biological system, or is it going to stick around as this chemical in the ground somewhere? So while it's really small, I mean, when you get millions and millions of tons of plastic, it's going to add up at some point. So, any other questions? Okay. There's some other this is not just TPS. There's cellulose and cellulose acetate. So in cellulose acetate, it's actually discovered in 1865 by a French chemist, Paul Schutzenberger, German name, French chemist. Okay, discovered cellulose reacts with acetate and anhydrase to form cellulose acetate, and it was used as a biopolymer and used a lot in garments as well. But it breaks down in the dryer, so it's been phased out for certain things like rayon as well. But it's one of the more, I guess, older uses of a biopolymer. And cellophane, also made from cellulose, is one of those biopolymers that was an older material, but biodegradable. And yes, moving on, this back to the same publication gave the table of these bio-based but not biodegradable polymers. Now these all need to be mostly need to be recycled, or they need to be done with chemically recycled, breaking down to monomers and whatnot. They don't biodegrade as well. And these are things like biopolyethylene, right? And so biopolyethylene is made out of it can be sugarcane or beets or starch crops. I found this graphic here, which is actually pretty interesting to see that 1 hectare of land, which I don't really know how big that is, but not terribly large, I assume, makes up to 3 tons of the green polyethylene, which it's pretty cool. But it is also one of the downsides. It is land that you would be using for food, right? So you're replacing area for food with things that you're going to be using for these plastics. So that's a trade-off that a lot of people have trouble making. And that's a lot of the conversation we have in the energy circles is, are we using land that we should be using for food for energy, and is there any other way, right? But this is where we get back into those drop-in replacements. Now, being a drop-in replacement, meaning when you get to a certain point, right, you get to, becomes bioethylene. I'll show you down here. It says becomes bioethylene. Bioethylene and ethylene is the same thing. There's no difference. I don't know why they call it bioethylene, because it's just ethylene, right? As a chemist, that's what it is. So then it could go right into that same supply chain for the ethylene, and it's identical because it is. And there's also bio PET. Now, this is I'm going to talk about a particular case of bio PET because it's pretty well encompassing, right? So Coca-Cola launched something they call a plant bottle, right, where they're trying to make their bottles out of 100% plant material, right? So Coca-Cola, together with Ford Motor Company, Heinz, Procter & Gamble, announced the formation of the Plant PET Technology Collaborative in 2012. And they were working together to develop 100% plant-based PET materials. And they have some that are already used in the you see here, the Dasani or the Odwalla, and they have some ketchup bottles that are made out of this. Now this is plant-based, but once again, it's a drop-in replacement. It goes into the recycling, and it's recyclable just like PET is, but it's not compostable. And biopolypropylene is something they're developing as well. If you recall that earlier slide, maybe I should put it here, where polypropylene was the single largest area of plastic that had use right? The global use of plastic with polypropylene is the largest amount. So this biopolypropylene will be, instead of taking carbon dioxide, taking carbon out of the ground, we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by using plants, and we're converting it into polypropylene. And it's used to make durable goods, and it's also very highly recyclable. So that's kind of where the industry is with a few of the main pieces at play. But then I got curious. I'm like, well, what's next? Where are we going? What is the future look like? And where is innovation happening? And so we talked a little bit about the marine degradable plastics, right? And how some marine degradable, but the challenge of having the oceans filled with plastic is really a problem. So there was a paper from 2012 that started addressing this and come develop a new marine degradable polymer, or marine degradable polylactic acid. So if we look here at the standard system for polylactic acid, it needs this enzymatic degradation, right? So they were able to introduce a copolymerization with the PEA, polyesterase acetyl group here, in order to give it a handle for the degradation to happen in the marine environment. And you can see here with the data they present that over the period of 45 days, the standard polylactic acid doesn't break down, but you're seeing a lot more degradation in the PEA introduced copolymerization of that polylactic acid. So it's kind of showing where we're moving in the direction of solving some problems, but some problems still remain. So really interesting chemistry like this will go and help those different use cases for it, right?
John?
Yeah.
That DOX that they introduce, is that bioderived, or could be bioderived, or is that, made from fossil fuels? I don't know if they talk about that.
I don't know. Yeah, I that's actually a really great question. Whether made of fossil fuels or not. No,
And do you recall roughly? Oh no, I see the answer to my next question there. Okay. Like what proportion they're including? And it looks like the figure 3 has 4%.
Yeah, dollars. Yeah, the 4%. Yeah, it's just a small amount as a copolymerization. I read that. There's a lot to cover, so I didn't dive too deep into all these papers, and I apologize for that.
We have another question in the chat, it looks like. Kezi asks, what is the point of bioethylene if it is not compostable and only recyclable, if polyethylene is already recyclable now?
Great point. It's an excellent point. That is the conversation that's happening right now. But I think the purpose for that is the fact that fossil fuels are limited, right? And using them, if we're going to be taking carbon out of the ground and putting it into the cycle, it would be this cycle of having carbon in the consumer space and then into the mechanical recycling spaces is a place where we're storing carbon. So sequestering atmospheric carbon into that cycle, while it is getting it out of the atmosphere. It's maybe not as clean or as neat as it would be good for a good solution, but it is a way to sequester carbon. So at the very least, you're sequestering carbon because there's a demand for it anyway. So might as well use the carbon that we already have pumped into the atmosphere rather than anything else.
I have a
agree
question.
with you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, this is Larissa. I'm wondering, do the papers, just based on what you've seen, when people are studying these, adding copolymers or adding a different functional group into the backbone of a chain, are they often looking at mechanical properties as well? Because that's an area that I've heard of a lot of pushback in a lot of bioplastics, is that, like if you introduce this functional group into the backbone that allows it to start degrading more easily in different environments, it also probably affects the properties of the material. So is that a concern, or is that something people are looking at?
I hate to be the first person to tell you, but a lot of academic papers are just absolutely incomplete.
You're not the first person to tell me. Don't
Okay,
worry.
all right. I was like, okay. So yeah, you're gonna see the same thing in anything. People are speaking to their strengths and not their weaknesses, and there's not as much rigor in some of these papers, and there's a lot of excitement and there's progress, but yeah, you find something people talk about the mechanical properties. Sometimes people don't talk about the mechanical properties, and I know as a experienced consumer that the actual feel of the material, like how it feels and kind of the interface with it, that's important, and those aren't discovered as well. So there's a lot of things that really need to make a whole product that aren't really covered in the papers at this point, and maybe that's just because they're working on their small areas. But you're right. The actual mechanical properties of the materials should be focused on, and a lot of these things are in journals that are focused on like green chemistry or in some other fields, and not necessarily some of the harder material science focused reviewers, which would ask those relevant questions.
Just to follow up on that, do you feel like there is a space in the industry that people are filling that role in, like either more on the production side rather than academic research or recycling companies? Like, I don't even know, but is this space being filled, or is that kind of a place you see as a big gap between scientific understanding and implementation?
So what I do know, right? I mean that's asking. I feel like from my study of this that there is a large opportunity here to be able to build something that is that ideal, because people think it's there already. So there's obviously a demand, even though they don't know they need it yet. They think they have it. So I think that yeah, there is room to grow with there. I don't know if it needs to come from private industry, or it needs to come from academia. Probably both. But if you saw that the Coca-Cola did this initiative and they're like really talking about their plant bottle, it's really big for them. But really, as you said, it's not that quadrant one. It's not that ideal, right? So Europe seems to be the location for most of the publications that really talk about this and actually talk about not just the materials development, but also like the landscape and about testing these things. There's a lot more, I guess, emphasis on this in a lot of publications that are coming out of European labs, academic labs. There's one trend that I noticed, because I kind of like to see where they're coming from, right? To see, take a notice of that, especially if they talk about, they're talking about like the country or Europe as a whole. Sometimes they'll give data, you want to see where it goes from. A lot of it's coming from Europe. So I think it's an area that really could be explored, and I think they're leading the way in Europe, and I'm not really sure what the landscape looks like there for industry or academic partnership.
Thanks. That was a very helpful answer. Thank you.
Oh, great. I had no idea what I was talking about. In general. Yeah, there's a lot here. It's really big, and I definitely feel like I came into it with I was too ambitious or too like, I didn't know what I was really getting into, and realizing this is a very big thing. And I could have given an entire talk on composting, which would have been a little bit of a bait and switch, but it's still interesting. Maybe someone should do that at some point. You're not going to get out of here without me talking about algae. Sorry. You guys know me. It's what I love. So algae is really cool because, first off, it's like the purest form of a plant possible. So a lot of these solutions, I talked a little bit about some of the bacterial solutions where you're growing up these like sugarcane or beets, and you're feeding them to the microbes. Microbes are making your PHA. But you can make a lot of stuff directly from algae, a lot of precursors from algae, and algae eats sunlight, right? So you're not going and having to grow up crops, which is one of the concerns for is growing up these crops in order to be able to make the feedstocks for those bacteria, or just feedstocks directly for the plastics. We're able to go and grow the algae. And here's a nice table which you have to look into later. This is probably too much data to put on a presentation, but I did like this. This shows like the pathway of where a lot of this algae will make these particular precursors, right? And you have some of my favorites like Seneca cystis 6803 or Senecacoccus PCC 7002. These are selected, and some coming from my expertise, I recognize these are selected for this process not because they have the most amount of FP6 to make mannitol, or they have the highest amount of the just G3 precursors or whatever these precursors are. It's because these have the most amount of tools for biology. So there's an opportunity here to build tools for the algae that maybe could do the job even better because they're naturally already halfway there. Or really double down on some of these ones we have tools on and learn from some of the algae that makes things in a way that will get you halfway there. Because the easiest way to engineer a product out of a microbe is to start with something that's mostly there anyway. This also is some cool stuff. You see that one image of the algae. See the PHBs. They're collecting large amounts of these precursors inside of them, and they're fine. They're okay to be there inside the algae. They're biologically compatible. And the cool thing about algae is you turn it on. If you look at this slide here, right? What happens is you grow the algae during the light time, and then you turn off the lights, and then it says it switches over. Because algae can do that. A lot of these microbes can switch over. They're heterotrophs, and they say, okay, well, now that we don't have any sunlight, let's start building other things. And what they're building is storing the energy in this PHB, right? So-called yellow sage, and then you develop the products from there. And this little cycle here talks more. A lot of these things are in cycles. Talks about the advantages of using algae, because you're not using the crops, and they grow semi-continuously, and all these, the downstream processing is a lot easier. Algae grows in this beautiful green color. It's really nice to look at if you're working on it. So that's basically the most of the talk, but I have a little bit of some of these data here to give you a perspective on what the industry looks like, right? So my thought is that you guys were going to be the next generation of innovators. So you should know where these things stand. And you see how these bio-based but not biodegradable materials are 83% of the bioplastics in 2019, and we have about 16.4% of the biodegradable ones, right? With PLA being the largest, and biodegradable polyesters, those two being the largest categories there, and bio-PET being by far the largest of the bio products, but it's not biodegradable. And you see this rigid packaging is the largest area. So by far, there's the most amount of production in this rigid packaging. So maybe even development of non-plastic alternatives to those rigid packaging could be solutions to some of these problems. And what those problems are? Well, the conditions for biodegrading need to be very particular, and that they could be more expensive than the current plastics. They grow. Sometimes you need to use fossil fuels in order to harvest them and to process them and do all certain things. And right now they're less than 1% of the global plastics market already. So there's a lot of room to grow on here, and it's this one projection has it growing to. Actually, I think this was a 2015 infographic that I took this from, and that's why it's different than in between here 2020. But it's looking to grow to be 40% of the market by 2030. I don't know how much I believe that. Maybe it's an optimistic growth, but definitely it's a ripe area for innovation. So if anybody has ideas, I think it's a good time to start employing them. So any more questions?
John, I have a question about whether there are innovations for a better at-home composting, whether that's adding enzymes or, like products like a trash can that can heat up or something. I don't know. Are there better innovations there?
While I was doing my research for this, I listened to a couple interviews on composting experts, which is a lot more interesting than it sounds at first glance, by the way. So they were talking about how, and I read actually a paper that was comparing some of this stuff about, while you can simulate these things at home, what you need to do is you need to grind it up, into pieces. Sometimes people run them over the lawnmowers, they break them up. You need to have this chipper processing thing. You need to be able to aerate it more, turn it over more. They have fans. I had a picture that I took out of a commercial facility, and basically imagine a big pile of dirt, right, with big tubes going into it, like regularly tubes going into it. That's blowing air into it to get air and hot air to get it going. So you can simulate all that at your home composting, and especially if you live in an environment where getting to 50 degrees C on the inside of an active biological composting pile isn't crazy, right? For a long part of the year, you'll be able to do that. Also, inoculating them with the right kind of microbes. I don't know about the legal requirements for that and everything. That I'm not going to say go out and start putting microbes in your environment, but I'm not saying that as well. So these innovations can lead to better at-home composting. But my perspective on it, as I had said earlier in the talk, is that I think that the market for composting at home is a very passive way of doing it, and being more active might deter people from doing it. But there are plenty of people that would be happy to actively, take part in their home composting. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think somebody in the chat mentioned something about mushroom-based bioplastics. Can you talk about that also? Yeah, if that's mushroom-based textile. I've seen that a lot.
I've had a conversation with mushroom people, and it's amazing what mushrooms can do, and they do, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't want to speak to that because it didn't come up during my my research, and I think it may be a language part. There might be some terminology for it that wasn't coming up in my searches. So that's a really great point, and I now that you say it, I probably should have thought of that because it makes sense.
Can I ask one more question? This is Larissa again. I was wondering, I know you mentioned this about the biodegradable plastics needing a much more specific environment than just throwing them into a landfill. Have you seen a lot of evidence? I guess 5 years ago when I was looking into this, that was a big hurdle. Have you seen a lot of evidence that there are facilities that are better able to handle this, either recycling facilities or landfill facilities that encourage breakdown of the biodegradable things?
No, I in the research, and I'll just to remind you guys, I the algae thing I know a lot more about because that's my area of interest. Getting into bioplastics, I did all of my research for this talk, so there's a lot of things that I didn't cover. I think I read 40 papers roughly, or skimmed 40 papers and read a portion of those. So there's a lot of literature that I have not come across, and I did read a lot about commercial composting facilities and what they do in order to be able to make it happen. But as far as landfills and recycling places being proactive in utilizing the material for this, I did not read anything about that. But it wouldn't surprise me that they would want their efficiency. Although I will say, in 2012, I took a tour of a facility that was it was a landfill, and what they did collect a lot of the waste that they were using, and they would cap it, and they would use it to do energy production. So they would use it, and they would do some of this digestion. They would use it, and they would make this really dirty methanol exhaust waste, and they would clean it up and use it in their turbines. So as far as that goes, I do know that there are facilities that do cogeneration with the waste, but I can't speak to anything, I guess, since 2012.
Cool, thank you. Also, this presentation is awesome. Thank you. I know I'm asking a bunch of questions about random parts, but I learned a lot.
Oh, great. I mean, I'm glad you did. I learned so much too. It was Yeah, like I said, I never thought I'd be so interested in composting.
So I think maybe you talked about this with the mushrooms, but I guess there's also part of this person talking about it's just, it sounds like they're talking about bacteria or things that could break down sort of non-bio-based or non, plastics that we would consider to be non-biodegradable.
Fungus was listed earlier. I did not say it, so maybe I didn't say it out loud. And oh, come on, computer. On this, I gave you time. Oh, really? Okay. Now, if you see here, we do talk about the anaerobic, the bacteria, no fungus, and the aerobic is bacteria and fungi. So I do believe they are an important part of the biodegradation process, as they are in the natural environment. Fungi will help break down just random leaf litter in the woods. So they're absolutely part of the ecosystems here for breaking it down. But the structures that are formed in fungi and in that and to that extent even in the larger mushrooms that you can see, those structures do have a lot of really relevant biological molecules that I'm sure could be utilized into making of polymers. Maybe they're a part of some of the molecules we've seen here, or maybe they're not. Someone once a mushroom friend of mine gave me a paper that did show a lot of biologically relevant precursors that are made by in various fungus, and it was frankly, it was incredibly dense. There were so many different molecules, and I didn't see about ones that could be relevant for plastic in that. But I can imagine that with a little bit of tinkering, you could do a lot with that kingdom of life there.
Sorry if I missed this. I had to step away for a few minutes, but I'm curious. It seems like setting up finding the right environment for degrading these things is like basically the challenge. Well, is there something that people are doing to build in the environment into the plastics, like seeding them with certain catalysts that maybe get triggered that help with the breakdown, something that is internal to the plastic that then gets activated to help with the degradation?
Yes, actually, I don't mind going back to it because it was really cool. And did you see the marine degradable plastics? Did you see this part?
Oh, this is maybe the slide that I actually missed. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah. So that's exactly right. And this is what they did is they said why I added it because it was really cool. They said, look, this PLA is good, but we don't have the enzymes here to degrade it, right? What's going to happen, right? So they put this copolymerization about 4% DOX to make this PEA, and that breaks down much more significantly in the 45-day test that they did here in aqueous conditions. So I did hear some criticism during one of the interviews that I was listening to about this concept, about how the laboratory environments for testing some of these things don't necessarily represent enough of the aquatic environments because the ocean varies upon itself greatly. So that's a bit of a takeaway. When I came across this, if anyone did research on this like I did, you'll see so much criticism and so much aspiration. It was really kind of it was interesting to see, and there was also a lot of like marketing on it. A lot of people that were just like kind of marketing their thing, and people that were trying to market something different from it. So it was there's a lot there, but it's a really cool. Well, these are both really cool technologies, the bio-based plastics and the biodegradable plastics, and they have a lot to go. And I definitely think that innovation in this is going to have a big impact on how we live our everyday lives.
Cool, thanks.
Oh wow, it's getting late. Any other questions?
One quick question that I think you addressed is the issue of recycling bioplastics. It sounds like they're chemically indistinguishable from conventional plastics, so they can all go to the same recycling facility, but just wasn't sure if that was the case for all of them or just a subset.
The bioplastics that are bio-based plastics that are made from biological precursors, or biologically produced precursors, recently biologically produced precursors. I guess the oil came from dinosaurs, but that's not what we're talking about. The recent biological precursors, those are called drop-in replacements, in which they are identical to the plastics that are made from the petroleum distillates. Yes. The biodegradable plastics are different because they have to be different because they're different compounds. Right. They can be degraded. So those things like PLA, those things are not, they don't go in the same supply chain. However, those like PLA can be recycled. I believe PLA can be recycled mechanically into a thermoplastic. I'm not sure of the quality of it, but I did hear some things, people talking about things that are bioplastics that can be that can be biodegraded or composted, but also can be mechanically recycled.
Got it. Thanks.
All right. With that, let's all please join me in thanking John. Great presentation. And join us next week. Same time, same place.